It is now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Tim Wise is among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators throughout the United States. He's also the host of the new podcast, Speak Out with Tim Wise. He's lectured internationally. Wise has provided anti-racism training to educators and administrators nationwide. He is the author of 7 books. His writings are taught in colleges and universities across the nation. From 1999 to 2003, Mr. Wise was an advisor to the Fisk University Race Relations Institute in Nashville. He's been featured in several documentaries, one being White Like Me, Race, Racism, and White Privilege in America. He graduated from Tulane University in 1990 and received anti-racism training from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Tim Wise.
Thank you. Well, I want to appreciate and offer some words of appreciation to all the folks who made it possible for me to be here today. This is a nice sized crowd doing amazing work. I do want to start out, however, by saying that for those of us who have been in this work, and when I say this work, I mean the work of social justice and racial and economic equity for a long time, there is a certain cynicism that I think we have to have about ourselves, because we have, and I'm one of them, many grown-ass men and women who've been doing this for a long time and not doing a very good job of succeeding at it. And we say we're committed and we say we're about something, and I believe that we are, but as long as we continue to fail at this, we're going to have to maybe cede some ground, cede some space, and start giving some credit to the young folks who are sitting over in that part of the room who I suspect will have some insights that escape us. And so if you do nothing else during the course of this summit, please introduce yourself to some of these young people, and don't talk to them, listen to them, and let them teach you about the issues that we're discussing here today. And this actually ties in to something I wanted to address in the larger course of my speech, because see, we sometimes devalue the wisdom of young people the same way that we devalue the wisdom and the insights of poor people of whatever age, the way that we blame poor people for their poverty, we blame the struggling for their struggles, the same way we devalue the wisdom and the insight and the lived experiences of women, as is happening right now in the Senate Judiciary Committee as I speak, where a woman is once again, as was the case 27 years ago, having to sit in front of a group disproportionately of men who have already made it clear they do not care what her life experience was. They do not care what she experienced in 1982. They are going to vote how they are going to vote because they do not value her life. They do not value her wisdom. They do not value her memory. And until we as men stand up and announce no more will we continue to cover up the crimes against women in this country and around this world, then this kind of charade will continue. This is what we do in our culture. We devalue survivors of injustice, whether it's economic injustice, racial injustice, gender injustice, sexual injustice, injustice on the basis of disability or whatever the case might be. We don't value the stories. Men think we know women's lives better than women know them. White folks think we know black and brown folks' lives better than they know them. People who are not poor and have never been poor think we know the lives of poor people better than poor folks know them. And we are going to instruct them how to live, you see. This is what we do. So if we really want to solve these problems, we're going to have to address our own complicity in them and the way that we have contributed to them by our silence and by our dismissal of the lived reality of those we claim to care so much about. That was my preface, now the speech. You know, we are being told, are we not, that things have never been better in this country. That the economy is stronger than it has ever been, which is a lie. That wages are higher than they have ever been, which is a lie. That unemployment is lower than it has ever been, that too a lie. None of it accurate, and yet all of it repeated day after day after day. While the economy is certainly chugging along for some, and it has been for quite a while, 9 long years, I beg to remind you, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, for millions more, the recovery never actually happened at all under either Democratic or Republican administration. So we are in some ways living that reality that Charles Dickens spoke to in the first line of Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. There are some for whom times have never been better. The top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1%, doing better than they have ever done. Indeed, all of the income gains of the last several years, all of them, not most, all of them, have redounded to the top 10% of income earners in this country, disproportionately the wealthiest 1% of Americans. They are not trickling down, filtering down, or being shared by average everyday workers. Non-supervisory, typical workers in this country have seen their wages not increase, but stagnate or even decline, adjusted for inflation. People at the bottom and the middle are losing ground, not gaining ground. People at the top, perhaps gaining ground, but this is not only their country. The gap between the rich and poor continues to grow. Right now, the wealthiest 1/10 of 1% of all Americans owns the same amount of wealth as the bottom 90% of all Americans. And there are 37 people in the entire country who have the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of all Americans. I want you to think about that. 37 people who have the same amount of wealth as 165 million people in our country. And yet we're told that we live in a society where anyone can make it if they just try, and wherever you end up is all about your own effort. Does anyone in this room with a straight face wish to suggest to me that there are 37 people in this country, 6 of whom just so happen to be connected to the Walmart fortune, who are so genius, who have worked so much harder than everybody else, whose brains are just that much bigger, whose work ethic is that much greater than 165 million people? Because if you believe that, you're in the wrong room. If you believe that, you need to return whatever academic credential you last received. Because the money that either you spent, your family spent, or I as a taxpayer spent was wasted on you. It is not conceivable, and yet our country makes us believe that those at the top are there by dint of their effort, and those at the bottom are there for lack of the same. And yet these numbers call into question that truth among rational people. And yet we hear them over and over again repeated, these ideas that we all get out of the system what we put into the system. And instead of responding to the struggles of poor people and working people with compassion as they slide further down the scale, even as the rich get richer, we are increasingly a culture of cruelty and condemnation vis-a-vis those poor and working class people. We blame them for their poverty because of their so-called irresponsible choices in life, just as we praise the rich for their supposedly responsible choices in life, like, for instance, the responsible choice to get control of a real estate portfolio handed off to you by your father in the late 1970s or early 1980s in New York City at a time when property was cheap. That was a great choice. It was a great choice. I'm sure we all would have made it had we the option to have done so. I still have about 40 minutes of this. So. You might want to chew slowly if you haven't finished. We blame the poor for their condition as we praise the rich for theirs, but it wasn't always this way. It's very interesting. If you look at the course of American history in regard to how we view poverty and hardship, there was a time, not that long ago, maybe 80 years, when we looked very differently at the poor. We did not think that they were poor by virtue of their lack of work ethic. We understood there were structural and systemic reasons for poverty during the Great Depression. We understood that people were out of work through no fault of their own, that there were structural conditions in the economy that led to the immiseration of millions of people. And we had sympathy for them, at least the white ones, let me be clear. We didn't have much sympathy for the black and brown, but at least for the white poor, there was this forbearance, right? There were these heart-rending stories about the Dust Bowl, these farmers that couldn't make anything grow in the soil. And there were these heart-rending stories about hobos riding the rails, looking for work. Folk singers wrote songs about them. In today's world, we would call them bums and we would call them lazy, but they were heroes at the time. They were looked at as folk heroes because we understood that there were conditions beyond the control of average people that had created such hardship and misery for so many. But at some point, this forbearance went away. This compassion diminished even for the white poor, for poor people generally. Now I ask you, what happened, when did it happen, and why did it happen? Because if you don't understand the answers to those questions, you will not understand the culture of cruelty in which we currently live. How did we go from being a country that understood that poverty and hardship were not the result of bad character, but the result of broken systems, to a country that actually does want to believe that all hardship and poverty is just the result of irresponsibility? Well, what happened is this. Beginning in the mid-1960s, the media imagery of poverty began to change. For many years, it had been those images from the Dust Bowl Midwest. It had been those images of mostly white folks on soup kitchen lines during the Great Depression, right? It had been pictures of the Appalachian poor in the early 1960s. Right. All of a sudden, the media imagery changed. Prior to 1970, about 2/3 of all media representations of the poor in this country were of white folks. After 1970, 3 out of 4 media representations of the poor and struggling were black and brown. And why do you think that matters? Well, it matters because once poverty was racialized, once hardship was racialized, once unemployment was racialized, once relying on social safety net programs, which white folks had been doing at that point for 30 years, I beg to remind you, was racialized as a black and brown thing, all of a sudden we discovered our inner libertarian that says we don't like big government anymore. We loved big government when it was doing stuff for our families. Big government built the white middle class, do not forget. Big government is what created the FHA loan programs and the VA loan programs and the GI Bill and built the interstate system. That wasn't done by magnanimous private sector actors. That was done with the power of the state. And before that was done, there was no white middle class in this country. We did that collectively. And no one complained. You didn't see, 1957, the top marginal tax rate in this country was 91%, y'all. 2.5 times what it is now, almost 3 times what it is, 91%. Every dollar you made above $400,000 as a couple, 91 cents of it went to the government. Taxes were far higher, and we didn't have tax rebellions in 1957, people complaining about that. Why? Because the benefits were viewed as going to people like us. So white America didn't complain, we didn't care, we believed in big government, we believed in big government programs, but as soon as those programs and the need that made them necessary were racialized as black and brown, only for those people over there on that side of town, on that side of the tracks, on that side of the interstate, then all of a sudden we decided that big government was dangerous and it made you lazy, right? And so our compassion began to wane, and politicians began to exploit this new media imagery with their own rhetoric, trying to take advantage of white racial resentment and resentment against the poor to push their own agenda. Ronald Reagan famously ran for president first in 1976, and one of his stump speeches was about a welfare queen who would drive to the welfare office in Chicago. She had 80 names, 130 social security numbers, 3 dead husbands on whom she was collecting benefits. This was a lie. It was not an accurate story. It was a gross misrepresentation of the truth, but that story was told over and over and over, just as he also told a story about strapping young bucks. I wonder what imagery comes into our mind when we hear that. Strapping young bucks buying T-bone steaks with food stamps. Because he knew even though that story was a lie, as well, concocted by a speechwriter, no actual story to comport with the rhetoric. He knew that that would work in a public that had turned against any efforts to really help the poor other than to moralize to them and to blame them for their own failures. And politicians began to exploit that. Lee Atwater, a famous conservative political operative and campaign manager who worked for a number of Republican candidates from the 60s all the way until he died in the 90s, admitted on tape in 1981 that what his side was doing was deliberately using coded language to turn people against black folks and the programs that were intended to benefit working and poor people. He said, rather than use blatant racist rhetoric, you had to talk about taxes and welfare and crime and busing and all of these coded dog whistle type phrases and words. He admitted this is what they were doing as a way to turn folks against programs of need and uplift. By the 1980s, that had become fully normalized, and it continues to be with us today. But there is an irony in this. And the irony is that as we watched our politicians and the media, directly or indirectly, demean the poor and racialize poverty, thereby resulting in a reduction in the compassion felt toward the poor and support for the programs intended to help them, the irony was that that demeaning of the black and brown poor had a residual collateral damage effect on the white poor too. And so now we have white poor folks, especially in rural America, including here in this state, who feel, do they not, invisible, who feel, do they not, forgotten, and yet they don't understand the irony of their situation. They are precisely invisible because politicians whom many of them voted for rendered them invisible so they could bash black folks at their expense. There is an irony in that. When you vote for politicians who tell you those are the bad folks over there, don't be surprised when nobody's paying attention to your pain, you see? And when you cut the safety nets that support those people over there, don't be surprised when those same nets have holes on your side of town. And when you attack the very logic of those programs, don't be surprised that when you need them, they are not there for you. You see, when you do not take care of business on the front end, when it's affecting the canary in the coal mine over here, I promise you, if you wait around long enough, and we have, and now we see it, the problem will come back to haunt you. And so I have no doubt that those rural white folks are hurting. Millions of jobs have been lost, plants have shut down, job opportunities going away. But I beg to remind you that that did not happen only to them and only in the last 8 years. I beg to remind you that those same plants that are now leaving small town America and suburban America and even to some extent rural America started leaving urban America beginning in the early 1970s, and nobody said boo about that. We didn't have politicians running around saying, my God, we've got to do something for these poor black and brown folks in the cities to get these jobs back to them. No, what we said to the black and brown poor was get off your ass and go get a job. Why don't you move? That's what we said. But now some rural white folk in pain saying you need to bring the jobs to us. We are owed these jobs. And by the way, I think poor and working class people are owed something by our society, whether they're white, black, or otherwise. But isn't it interesting that the very people who now expect the government to bring the jobs back to them had no such forbearance when it was black and brown folks losing their jobs, losing their livelihood, being laid off, last hired, first fired, every single time in every recession? This is what happens if you don't take care of the problem on the front end. It is going to come back and bite you on the ass on the other end. If you don't care when black and brown folks are being screwed over by lenders who are coming into their community and offering these subprime loans at ridiculous terms, as happened, and ultimately blew up the economy. When you don't take care of that, beginning in the 90s when it started in black and brown America, and nobody wants to regulate the lenders, and nobody wants to limit the interest rates that they're allowed to charge, and nobody wants to stop these kinds of predatory loans because free market, free market, free market. Nobody wants to do anything about it because capitalism says you can't. Capitalism says, oh no, they just, let the buyer beware. They're making money. That's what it's all about. So you let black and brown folks get screwed over, and then you're surprised when the lenders say, hey, you know what? We made a lot of money on the backs of black and brown folk. Let's go do that with some white people, right? So they left the urban areas and they went into the suburbs and ran the same scam. And then they left the suburbs and went to the exurbs. Y'all know what the exurbs are, right? Exurbs, this is an area that some white folks created when we determined the suburbs weren't white enough, right? When we discovered, much to our chagrin, that black folks like Olive Garden too, we were like, gotta go. Gotta go. We're just gonna build some stuff even further out. And you thought the banks couldn't find you there, but you were wrong. And they found you and they said, look, we will offer you this loan. It's really low interest right now. Now, yeah, it's gonna blow up here in about 6 months, but don't worry, we'll totally refinance it for you. And people fell for it because they could, because we hadn't regulated it. So the housing crisis that began in urban America and rendered so many folks in urban spaces poor and destitute 10 years earlier suddenly affected white folks, and the whole economy imploded. Once again, if you don't take care of the problem when it affects these people, don't be surprised when the cancer spreads, metastasizes to your part of the community. This is basic common sense, but the best example of all is the opioid epidemic. Here we have a nation in the grips of a panic about these poor white folk dying from opioid addictions. Either the oxy that they've been prescribed by unscrupulous doctors, pushed by unscrupulous pharmaceutical companies, or the heroin that they turned to when the oxy wasn't strong enough. But isn't it interesting, see, a couple things. We had an opioid epidemic in the 70s, a heroin epidemic in the 70s, concentrated mostly where? Black and brown space in the cities, and nobody said, let's get these folks treatment. Nobody said, let's get these folks help. Nobody said, let's help these folks get over their addiction. We said, lock them up. And then in the 80s, when the crack epidemic hit, we said the same thing. We said it's mostly those people. Let's just lock them up. We weren't talking about drug addiction as a health issue. We were talking about it as a criminal issue. So we didn't create the rehab, and we didn't create the drug education, and we didn't create the treatment programs. And what do you know? Here we are now. And we're supposed to feel sympathy for white folks who don't have the programs they need precisely because they didn't support those programs for black and brown folks. That is the textbook definition of irony. And we ought to have sympathy and we ought to have compassion, but we ought to have had that 40 years ago and 25 and 30 years ago. When you don't take care of the problem on the front end, once again, do not be shocked when the problem spreads. And there's another thing about the opioid epidemic nobody wants to talk about. See, it's very interesting. A couple years ago, this study comes out from Princeton, and it found that from 1999 to 2013, 14-year spread, there had been this huge uptick in deaths, excess mortality rates relative to what would have been predicted prior to 1999. For one particular group of people, right? Because if you know anything about mortality rates in advanced economies, normally they go down unless you have a huge natural disaster, an epidemic or something, right? You're always getting healthier, you're living longer in an advanced economy, typically. And that's true for all groups, including people of color, though their mortality rates are higher, the direction is still normally good, right? But from 99 to 2013, there was one group that saw this huge uptick in excess deaths. Who were they? And it was 500,000 excess deaths. 500,000 people died who would not have been expected to die if the trajectory had remained in the direction that it was going. So that's a big deal. 500,000 dead white folks. Not just white, though. White, working class, middle-aged, non-college educated white folks. Many of them in these small towns and rural communities and perhaps less affluent suburbs struggling with the globalization of the economy, et cetera, staring down the barrel of retirement, not having enough for retirement, not having enough for health care, not having enough for college education for their kids, or whatever the case might be. And when the study came out, everyone was trying to figure out what it meant, and it was referred to in the press as deaths of despair because the excess mortality was very specific in terms of what types of death we were looking at. It wasn't just people dying in their sleep or developing heart disease or whatever, right? It was disproportionately driven by three things: opioid overdoses, cirrhosis of the liver, typically brought on by what? Heavy drinking, and direct acts of suicide. In other words, self-inflicted death disproportionately. They called them deaths of despair, the argument being that these folks are hurting so badly, right? Unable to secure employment. Maybe they got laid off, and because they're in their 50s, it's hard to get a new job, man. You lose your job in your 50s, and the company would rather hire someone that's 25 that doesn't cost them as much money on health care. So you're sort of up against it, regardless of race in this country, if you're out of work and you're middle-aged, especially if you don't have a college degree. So these folks are hurting, they're in pain, and they can't take it, and they're killing themselves directly or indirectly. But then I started wondering something. I said, it's interesting, and we got to be worried about it, but now there's something about this that doesn't quite smell right. Because if you tell me that they're deaths of despair, which I can see the despair in the stories of many of these folks in rural white America who are definitely in pain. But here's the thing, I can also look at all of the economic well-being and health well-being indicators in this country. Poverty, unemployment, infant mortality, high school graduation rates, incarceration rates, all of the different indicators of well-being. And guess who's doing worse in every single one of those categories? Black and brown folks. So if these white folks are in despair, which I get, surely black and brown folks are in at least as much, if not more, and yet oddly, they are not killing themselves in the same numbers. They are not ODing on opiates in the same numbers, and they're not drinking themselves to death in the same way. Now, why? See, it can't be because their despair is any less. The only possible explanation, and it's one nobody wants to talk about, but we had better do it, is this. The difference is that black and brown folks have known despair for a very long time. The difference is black and brown folks always knew the system was a sham. Black and brown folks always knew it was a con. Black and brown folks always knew that every day was a grind and every day was a hustle. But if you've been white in this country for long enough, we have been told this will not happen to us. We have been told that misery, that pain will not be our lot. Because this society has always promised us, especially white men, even working class white men, always made the promise of at least horizontal mobility. What is horizontal mobility? We know what vertical mobility is, right? It's rags to riches or something like that. But horizontal mobility sounds like this. My granddaddy worked in the factory. My daddy worked in the factory. I'm working in the factory. And by God, I'm going to get my son a job with the union and he's going to work there. And black and brown folks could never take that for granted. But white folks could. And then when the economy globalizes and we start to realize the system maybe isn't all that it was cracked up to be, we're the ones who are not ready for it, y'all. It's not about being in greater despair. It's not about being in greater pain. It's about having had so much relative advantage compared to black and brown folks that we got soft. And now we don't have the coping skills and the mechanisms needed. We should have listened to black folks, y'all. We should have listened to brown folks. If we had listened to people of color telling us this thing was rigged, maybe we wouldn't be hurting so much, but instead we fought with black and brown folk. We didn't engage in solidarity with them. We pointed fingers at them. We blamed them for our high taxes. We blamed them for our loss of jobs. Right? I got an email from a guy a couple years back, young white man, right? Just manifesting this kind of mentality. Instead of acting in solidarity with black and brown folk in pain, he decided to take out his pain on black and brown folk. He said, I can't find a job because all the jobs are going to blacks and Mexicans. This is what he said. He said it all in capital letters and red font too. Totally unnecessary. You don't have to like me, but take the cap lock off and just use the regular font. I'll get the message. You don't need red font and big letters to let me know you're pissed. You can tell me in a lot of different ways, right? I can't find a job because all the jobs are going to blacks and Mexicans. I was like, really? All the jobs are going to blacks and Mexicans? Because it's funny because the Labor Department data says that black folks are about twice as likely as white folks to be unemployed even when they have the same level of education, and that Latinx folks are about 50% more likely to be unemployed than whites even when they have the same education. So I'm not sure what jobs these black and brown folks are taking from white people, but they are not taking them far. I don't know if these jobs are in Second Life. I don't know if these jobs are on Minecraft digging ditches. I don't know where these jobs are. And by the way, he then went on to say, like, a Latino guy had taken his job. Here's a little word of advice. If you don't get anything else out of this talk, it would be a damn shame because I've said a lot more. But if you don't take anything else away, just remember, when you say somebody took my job, my question for you, did you have the job yet? Because if you didn't have the job, they didn't take your job. You understand? Like when you say took my job, were you on the job? Were Were you on the payroll? Did they call you on Monday and say, Jim, congratulations, you got the job. Report for work on Wednesday. And then like on Wednesday, called you back up and they were like, just kidding, we're giving the job to Jose. Like if they did that, I too would be sympathetic to these claims, but that is not what is happening. Right? So instead of joining with those black and brown folk who were struggling and recognizing that they're all in the same, not quite the same, but a similar boat, this guy would rather point fingers. He would rather say, build the wall. He would rather try to say that these are the people who are responsible for his economic condition instead of realizing that we have crafted a system that just doesn't give a damn about poor people. Doesn't care about poor white folks, doesn't care about poor black and brown folks, just generally doesn't care about poor people. And now all of that pain that people of color have been dealing with for years and for generations, now white folks are starting to experience a little piece of that. And it's the first time that we've had to deal with that in a long time. During the Great Depression, we knew that kind of pain, but that's been 3.5 generations ago, right? So when you don't have that collective memory, see, I mean, when the recession hit for black and brown folks, that was just like a more extreme version of Tuesday, right? That wasn't like, it was not like, and it was the same during the Depression, right? You see all these images from the Depression, right? And you hear all these stories about guys jumping off buildings, right? These dudes like just jumping off tall buildings in New York City because the stock market crashed. Who do you think did that? You think black folks were climbing up to the top of the tallest buildings in New York and going, oh my God, the stock market has collapsed. I must now kill myself. No. Black folks were like, y'all want to get on the soup line? Because we got some soup. We've been getting soup a lot. Y'all want to get some soup? And it wasn't even poor white folks that threw themselves off of buildings, was it? Poor white folks knew. They've been on the line also. It was these rich white people that couldn't cope with not being rich anymore. They were just like, that's it. I've lost it all. I got to kill myself. So what I mean by coping skills, the reason we don't solve the problem of poverty is we don't want to listen to the experience of poor people. They got answers that they could teach us. They know how to survive. They know how to survive against all odds. We don't want to learn from them because we view them as pathological, right? I worked in New Orleans for about 15 months as a community organizer in public housing, and during that time, I would tell people what I did. You know, I'd be out, somebody, and they always want to know, what do you do? And in this country, they always mean, what do you do for a paycheck, right? They don't mean like your hobbies and stuff like that, right? So I tell them, and I always know, you know, you just don't have these conversations in a bar, but it was New Orleans, so it's all we got. And this guy asked me what I did for a living. I told him, and he offered, of course, unsolicited advice for the poor people with whom I worked every day. They always do this. You tell them you work with poor folks in public housing, they always want to tell you how we can fix those people, right? So he says, well, you know what we need to do. And I was like, please don't tell me. Just don't tell me. I don't care what you think we need to do, because it's going to be horrible. But I just sort of braced myself, took another drink. He said, you know what we need to do? I said, no, pray tell what? And he said, what we need to do is get some of these corporate executives and CEOs to go into the projects and teach these poor people how to manage money. I got thrown out of the bar for my response, which sounded a little something like an R-rated version of, surely you must be kidding. You want rich people, millionaires, to tell poor people how to manage money? Have you lost your mind? Give me a couple $1 million, I'll manage. Rich people don't even manage their own money, y'all. You do know this, right? Like, it's not like they actually sit and balance their own damn checkbook. Rich people get other people to do that for them. They don't know how to give me, look. The President of the United States has declared bankruptcy 6 times, even though he started out with a $200 million real estate portfolio and a $17 million direct loan from his father. I used to get $5 a week from my grandmother for allowance. I ain't declared bankruptcy yet. So the idea The idea that rich people know how to manage money better than non-rich people flies in the face of literally all the evidence that we have. Poor folks did not wreck Wall Street. Poor folks wouldn't even know how to get to Wall Street. Rich folks wrecked Wall Street. Rich folks tanked the economy. Rich folks made off with $12.5 trillion worth of other people's money, 20% of the accumulated net worth of this country that it took over 230 years to accumulate, and these smart bankers wiped it out in a year and a half. That's not talent at managing money. That is the decided lack of talent at managing money. If anything, we don't need rich people to tell poor folks how to manage money. We need poor folks to tell us how to survive and how they do it every day. I needed those women with whom I worked in public housing to explain to me how you survive on $385 a month and keep your children alive and a roof over their head and keep them safe. Because I don't know how to do that, and none of the kids I went to Tulane University with know how to do it, and none of those folks in mansions on St. Charles Avenue know how to do it, and none of the folks in the wealthiest homes of New Orleans or anywhere in this country know how to do it, but we've pathologized the poor. We don't listen to their solutions, and as a result, we keep doing the same thing over and over and over again and never solving the problem. And then that begs the question, doesn't it? Is this country really up to the task of eradicating poverty? I mean, do we really want to do it? I know the people in this room want to. I understand you're sincere, but I'm talking about the larger culture. Do we really want to do this? Because, see, we're smart people, right? And we're compassionate, caring. Most people, good people. Most people, decent people. Most people don't want to hurt other people. And yet, we never seem to be able to get our head around inequality and do much about it. And it makes me wonder if we can put a man on the moon, if we can do all the things that we've managed to do in this society and we can't eradicate poverty, I start to wonder whether that's really a goal that we actually have. And I start to wonder whether this system is really broken or whether it's doing exactly what it was intended to do. And I don't mean to sound too cynical, but stick with me for a minute. Stick with me for a minute, right? You have to really ask yourself, see, back to New Orleans, when Katrina hit, I was already out of the city at that point, 9 years. But when it hit, there was a really good documentary that was made in the aftermath of Katrina by Spike Lee called When the Levees Broke. And it was a great film, but there was one part of the film and Spike Lee's analysis around Katrina that I disagreed with, even though I almost always agree with his take on these things. There was one comment that he made it in an interview, and as I recall, it's in the film itself, where he talks about Katrina and what happened to the city of New Orleans as a, quote, system failure of monumental proportions. Those were his words. Now, I want you to think this through with me for a second. When you tell me that the displacement of tens of thousands of mostly black and overwhelmingly poor New Orleanians is an example of a system failure, what you are telling me, whether you intend to or not, is that before the hurricane came in, everything was working fine for those poor black folks. And then it all went to hell when the levees broke, right? What you're telling me is that the system failed, which means it was operating well and succeeding previously. But if you think that that system in New Orleans was working for poor folks, and particularly for poor black folks, I guarantee you have never spent any significant time in that city because it had never been working. So if a system was not constructed for your benefit, and then it proceeds to not serve your interest, is that system failure or is that system success, you see? Maybe it's the system doing exactly what it was set up to do, because in many ways, poverty is functional for some people. See, if we don't have poor people, you do understand it's very hard to get rich based on your own work. I mean, really rich. You can get comfortable, but there's only so many hours in a day. Only so many days in a week. There's only so much that you individually can do to get filthy, stinking rich. The way people get really, really, really rich is hiring other people to work for them and paying them less than the value of what they produce. Right? And that's how capitalism works. And that's not like some Marxist telling you that. That's like Adam Smith telling you that. He called it added value, right? So it's the idea that the employer hires people, they produce something, and then they get paid less than the value of what they produced for the owner of the business. Now, you can think that's a good system or a bad system, or you can be somewhere in between on that. It doesn't matter what you think about it. I'm just telling you, that's how people get really rich, is by essentially taking advantage of other people's work. right? And then skimming some of the value that they produce for themselves. Now, you can think that's a fine system, but at least can we acknowledge it means poverty is a requirement of that system? Because the only way that I can get you to work for me, particularly at wages that will not bring you above the poverty line, is if you have no alternatives. That's why we cut the safety net, because we don't want you to have options, right? That's why we don't eradicate poverty, because if you really eradicated poverty, where would all the low-wage workers come from? Right? You do understand, like our education system works on this model. I always love it when teachers tell me they got into teaching because they knew that education was the great equalizer. Really? Is it? See, I don't see any evidence of that, right? Black folks with a college degree twice as likely as whites with a degree to be unemployed, so it ain't equalized much. White households headed by high school dropouts have 1/3 more wealth on average than black households headed by college grads. So clearly, education is not equalizing much, but we like to tell this fiction, and we know it's a fiction. Schooling's not about creating equity, quite the opposite. Because if it were about equity, we wouldn't give standardized tests to unstandardized students who we afforded unstandardized resources, unstandardized curriculum, unstandardized teacher preparation, property taxes as the primary way of funding those schools, which means rich folks will have more money per capita than poor folks. If we believed in equity, we wouldn't do any of that. Standardized tests, by definition, are meant to sort and to separate and to keep people unequal, and it's always been this way. Thomas Jefferson, who back in the day was considered a very forward thinker when it came to schooling, he was a sort of an early educational theorist in our country, said famously in his notes on the state of Virginia, he said this, he said, what we need is 6 years of compulsory schooling. And he was just talking about for white folks. He didn't mean that for black folks or native folks. He was talking about white folks. 6 years of compulsory schooling so that we can rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. Now, I want you to think about what he's saying. He's saying the purpose of education is to help us identify the handful of people who were smart enough to run this thing, and the rest of y'all are trash. And once again, he was just talking about the white folks. Needless to say what he thought about black and brown folks. He's just talking about white people. Most of y'all trash, right? So the purpose of school is not to raise you. The purpose of school is not to create equity. It's to create inequity. 100 some odd years later, Woodrow Wilson, when he was the president of Princeton, he was also a forward-thinking, supposedly, educational theorist. He was considered to be an educational philosopher of some note. He had a similar way of saying it. He said, what we need is a small group of people to receive a liberal education. That was the term they used to use for college. And a much larger group to forego the privilege of a liberal education and prepare themselves for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks. In other words, it's sort of what Jefferson was saying. We have a small group of people running this thing, and the rest of y'all are going to be rubbish, and you're going to be working for us, and you're going to be doing the hard work that we're too good to do. So the purpose of education was not equality, it was inequality. Fast forward to 2001, and I'm watching one of the Sunday talk shows, and William Bennett is on. Some of y'all will remember Bill Bennett, former Secretary of Education and drug czar under President Reagan. Until recently, he was inarguably the worst Secretary of Education in the history of the country. But it doesn't take much to get bumped from that perch, and so 'tis happened, you know. But Bill Bennett was on one of the Sunday shows, and they were asking him about education in America, and the guy that hosts the show asked Bill Bennett, what's the biggest problem with education today? Now, that's a big question, right? That's a huge, meaty kind of question. Like, if you asked me that on national television, I would probably ask to go to a commercial break so I could think about it, and you come back to me, because I don't want to mess that up, man. That's a big question. He didn't miss a beat, though. He didn't need time. He had his answer. What do you think his answer was? He said, well, the biggest problem is, quote, too many people are going to college, end of quote. Stick with me. There's a point to this. Right? Now, let me be honest. I was trying to cut Bill Bennett some slack. I don't know why. I'd never done it before. But this particular day, I was feeling especially magnanimous, and so I decided, well, maybe there's more to this sentence. You know how sometimes you'll be talking to somebody, and the words will catch in your throat, and you're like, hold on, I just need some water. Hold on. It's like an internal ellipses in your mouth. You know those 3 dots, dot, dot, dot? Or like an M dash, or at least a comma, or a semicolon, or something, letting you know that there's more. So I thought maybe he was going to continue and say, too many people are going to college, dot, 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 who can't afford it because it's too damn expensive. No, he didn't say that. And I'm thinking, well, maybe he's going to say too many people are going to college who aren't adequately prepared because we haven't provided sufficient resources in the K-12 system to get them ready for college. Yeah, no, there was none of that. There was no M dash, no colon, no semicolon, comma, or internal ellipses. There was just a period at the end of his sentence. Too many people are going to college. Now ask yourself, who was he talking about? Was he talking about the mediocre rich children of mediocre rich parents who were themselves mediocre and rich? Because I've known plenty of rich and mediocre people in my life. Right? I know plenty of rich and mediocre folks, but no people that used to get what they used to call gentlemen's C's at Harvard. That was a thing, you know, like back in the day when the Ivy League was all white and all male and all East Coast rich white people, right? Everybody talks about, oh, higher education has been demeaned by diversity and affirmative. Are you kidding? You think affirmative action is what demeaned the educational quality of higher ed when you had white dudes that didn't even have to go to class in the day and they could just get a C for showing up because of who their daddy was? Well, you think they were actually brighter, right? Gentlemen's C's, right? They never were questioned as to whether they were going to go to college. You could go to Yale, get C's, because your daddy got you in, because they'd gone to Yale. And then you can get into Harvard Business School, and you can get C's. And then you can go back after becoming president of the United States and brag to the graduating class of Yale University that you got C's. And don't worry, don't let that discourage you. You too can become president with C's from Yale, right? No one ever questions when people like that are going to go to college. So when Bill Bennett said too many people are going to college, he's not talking about that guy. He's not talking about anybody like him. He's not talking about the rich and mediocre. You know who he's talking about. He's talking about people of color, and he's talking about working class people of all colors who are increasingly accessing higher education. He is saying, in effect, the mentality of the slave owner, y'all. What was the mentality of the slave owner? The mentality was, if they all learn to read, who's going to pick this cotton? You see? And if they all go to college, who's going to pick up my trash on Wednesday for $19,000 a year in crappy benefits? No one's going to do that. You got a college degree, you're going to think you're better than that. How do I know? Because I got a college degree and I've been led to believe that I am. Right? Even though the job that those men do in my alley picking up my garbage is the most important job in my neighborhood. There's a dude 4 doors down that sells stock. If he doesn't show up to work for 6 weeks, life will go on. If those dudes that pick up the trash don't show up to work for 6 weeks, we have got bubonic plague in my neighborhood. People are falling out dead, right? But they make 19 and some change, and the other dude makes 6 or 7 figures a year. That's the kind of system that we've constructed. It isn't about the value you create, except insofar as you create value for the people at the top who count. My point in telling you all this is that if we have a school system, if we have people who are at the head of those systems and thinking about those systems, who are telling us the purpose of schooling is inequality. It's not about equalizing opportunity. It's about inequality, which means unemployment ends up being functional. Poverty ends up being functional. Educational failure ends up being functional. It keeps us at each other's throat, doesn't it? Instead of working together in solidarity to change this system for the benefit of the vast majority of us. We need to face reality. This country was not constructed for the purposes of equity. And if you are standing at the end of an assembly line at a sausage factory, and you're surprised that it keeps giving you sausage, you're clearly not paying attention. It's like if you're at the end of the conveyor belt in the sausage factory and you're thinking to yourself, well, when am I going to get some chicken nuggets? You clearly need to walk back outside the factory and read the sign. The sign told you it was a sausage factory. Expect sausage. What I'm saying, to put it in computer and technical terms, that will be especially relevant, I would imagine, for some of the young folks in the room. If inequality were an app, right, poverty and unemployment and all the suffering that comes with it, that would not be a glitch. It would be a feature built in to the app. And if you don't like the outcomes, you have to build new technology. And you have to start over from the beginning. And you have to begin to listen to the stories and the lives of poor people, just like we have to listen to the stories and the lives of people of color when they talk about racism, and women when they talk about sexism and misogyny and rape culture, and LGBTQ folk when they talk about straight supremacy and transphobia, and disabled folk when they talk about ableism, and deaf folk when they talk about autism. And all of the different systems of injustice that operate in our society. And if we don't do that, we're never going to get a hold of these problems. It is time for us to realize that at the end of the day, the only choice we have is solidarity. If we do not engage in that, if we do not come to understand that unless you were in that top 1%, you are what Thomas Jefferson was calling the rubbish. And we have a society that will dispense with you without blinking an eye. And until we demand that we deserve to be treated better, all of us, until we demand that we be treated not as rubbish, but as the precious human beings that we all are, endowed with actual rights, not just the ones Thomas Jefferson spoke about in those pretty words, but the ones that we have never made real and must now make real. Until we do that, we are doomed as a society. There are only two choices. One is solidarity. The other is social entropy and social collapse. Make your choice and make it well. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. So I think we're going to do questions or no? You can do questions. Oh, I thought we had some time, so I would take a few if there were some. That was on my schedule. I hope I'm not messing anybody up by doing it. Okay. And I don't think we have mics in the room, but if you have a loud voice and you want, and you can project, we do have mics? Okay. I don't know where they are, but good luck if you have a question. Or we can just stare at each other for 10 more minutes. I'd be happy to answer a question, take a few questions. And then, by the way, when we're done, I only have 9 or 10 copies of my recent documentary. I'll be happy to sell them to you if you'd like. Do a little commerce here. Got kids going to go to college here soon, so. I doubt that 10 DVD sales is really going to pay for college, but, it's a start. Thank you.
I was going to say that since it takes a white male to get to white folk, have you ever thought about, I know you can't clone yourself, but trying to set up a seminar to get people to go on the road as a consulting for that, to try to hit colleges and schools and think from that standpoint?
Well, obviously I do that, and there are several other folks who do, including several white folks who do. Not enough, of course. We need more people. I am always a bit cautious about encouraging too many white folks to, take up this banner in a real prominent way. Not because I don't want the competition. It's cool, whatever. But because really, it's important for us to learn to listen not just to people who look like me, right? It's important for us to listen to black and brown folks who are really the source of even that wisdom that I am sharing here today. So I'm happy to play my part, and to do what I can do to maybe reach some people who otherwise might not be reached. But I do want to encourage everyone to not just hear it from me or Robin DiAngelo or, a handful of other folks who do this work, Peggy McIntosh, Chris Crass, a handful of other white folks, all of whom do fantastic work. Also hear it from people of color, and especially young people of color who were so instrumental in this movement all around the country, doing incredible work around everything from education reform issues to police reform issues to healthcare to jobs. All of it. The Movement for Black Lives, the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, Black Youth Project 100, a ton of organizations doing really great stuff. So we certainly have a small cabal, if you will, of white folks who do what we can. But part of what we can and must do is also steer other white folks to the work and the words of black and brown peoples and insist that we begin hearing them as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you, as a white man, professional white man, could speak to your experience with white privilege.
Sure.
Even as someone who has all of this verbiage and is able to tell this story, could you still speak to your experience with white privilege and acknowledging your own white privilege?
Sure. I just demonstrated it for an hour, for a good cause, but it was still demonstration of white privilege. I got up here and just said things to y'all that damn near every person of color in this room has said probably 1 million times since breakfast yesterday. If not to themselves, to others. And yet we know that when people of color say it, it is received very differently. I'm not saying that everybody was comfortable with the way that I said it either, because I know that's not true. But there's a level of comfort and a level of a lack of fear when I say it that is about privilege, and it's about the aesthetic that I present as a white person, as a man, as someone who's straight, as someone who is cisgendered, as someone who is college educated and therefore, at least in some regard, middle to upper middle class, I have a certain leeway, right, to express anger, to express raw humor and sarcasm in a way that people of color can't as readily get away with. Now, that's only one aspect of my privilege. Let me make it very clear to you, and this is something I think would be really great for everyone to do. We want to really deal with the culture of cruelty that fails to solve the problem of poverty. One of the ways that we can do it, and I write about this in my book, Under the Affluence, which came out a few years ago and talks about how we shame poor people and praise rich people and therefore endanger really the future of the country. One of the things that I point out is that one of the reasons we're able to be so cruel to people who are struggling is because we have internalized this mythology about meritocracy and rugged individualism and this idea that wherever you end up is all about your own effort. And we believe that about ourselves. And we want to believe it, right? People always say, well, I made it without help. I did it all on my own. I'm a self-made blah, blah. First of all, there's no such thing as a self-made anything, right? Unless you were raised on an island by a porpoise, you need to sit down, right? You just need to sit down, right? Like, that's just not how you had teachers, you had family, you had friends, you had mentors, right? If you ever do meet a true rugged individual, you need to get the hell away from that thing, because it is going to be feral, man. It's going to be dangerous. It's not going to know about that whole taboo about not eating your ass. Like, it's just going to eat you, right? Like it's just going to eat you because it doesn't know better, right? Like, everybody's had help, but we just don't like to be honest. Part of the help might be racial and connected to whiteness. Part of it might be economic and connected to affluence and coming from a well-off family. It could be gendered and being male in a male-dominated society. Or you know what it could be? It could just be luck, right? And we don't like to admit that. We don't like to admit to the role of luck in our lives, because if we've had good luck, that means we could have bad luck tomorrow. And we like to feel like we're in control. But listen, it's about privilege and luck. And let me tell you my story so we're clear. And I want to encourage everybody, do this for yourself, because if you can get clear on how you got where you are right now, right? And all the different things that went into that. Some of it might have been about various forms of unearned privilege. Some of it might have been just the people that came into your life that were mentors that believed in you when you were 9 years old and nobody else did, right? Or the person that helped you when you needed help the most. It could just, we've all had that. If you get clear on that, that's critical, because it's hard to look down on other people, isn't it? When you can look at your own story and say, I could be that person, they could be me, except for these 2 or 3 things that went differently. Being humble, right? Being humble, like Kendrick said, be humble, sit down, right? Stop bragging about your damn self and actually act like you live in a system that bestows these advantages. So here's my story. 2 things. Number 1, I'm here because of whiteness. Because when I got out of college, the very first job I got, which catapulted me to national attention, was working against David Duke in Louisiana when he ran for the U.S. Senate in '90 and governor in '91. Now, well, I don't need that for that. I mean, whatever, I did what I had to do, but I mean, when you get applause for fighting Nazis, we're in trouble. Like that's a pretty low bar, Woo! You're sort of supposed to fight Nazis without applause, but okay, I'll take it. It's better than the opposite, But so that was the first job I did, and it was a big deal, and it brought me to national attention, so I was able to parlay that into this career, right? But the only reason I got that job fighting David Duke, I was 23 years old, 22, 23 years old. Only way I got that job was I knew the 2 guys who started the organization. One of them was a history professor at Tulane. The other was a grad student and a friend of mine. They offered me the gig. If I don't go to Tulane, I don't meet those men. Now, how'd I get to Tulane? I went to Tulane because in spite of the fact that we were broke and couldn't afford it, and despite the fact that I got my financial aid forms in late because I'm really bad about procrastinating, right? My mom was able to go down to the bank and get a loan for the difference between what Tulane was offering, which was only like $8,000. I think it was going to cost $20 that year. Now it's like $60. So, but there was like a $12,000 hole. My mom goes down to the bank, gets a $12,000 loan. Now this is interesting because my mother didn't own any property. We didn't have any credit that wasn't bad. I lived in an 850 square foot apartment from the time I was 3 days old until the day I walked out the door to go to college. So how does someone with no credit, no collateral, get a $12,000 loan from the bank? Easy. You take your mom, that is to say my grandmother, down to the bank, and she can co-sign the loan, putting up her house as collateral in case I default. Her house, I should point out, the 4th or 5th house that she and her husband, my grandfather, who was dead 6 years at that point, had owned in neighborhoods where no people of color could have owned a home, and not by accident, but as a result of discrimination, having obtained loans that they could not have obtained. So in other words, I'm able to get that loan because of the whiteness of my family that allowed us to have certain property. Without that loan, I don't go to Tulane, I don't meet those men, I don't get that job fighting David Duke, and I'm doing something else today. And I just have to be humble enough to own that. That doesn't take away from whatever skill set I possess. As my mama says, I talk real good, right? But my ability to access any of that skill set owes to that experience. But let's get even deeper. It's also about luck. The only reason I was really at Tulane, putting aside the whiteness and the money thing, is that I was chasing a girl that was going to Louisiana State. True story. I was a debater in high school. She was a debater in high school, but she lived in Lafayette, Louisiana. I lived in Nashville, Tennessee. We met over the summer at a summer debate camp in Washington, D.C. at American University. I was not planning on going to Tulane. This is between junior and senior year. I'm thinking of going to Emory in Atlanta. I was going to debate for their team. The coach was recruiting me. That was where I was going to go. I had no intention of going to Tulane. Had never even really heard of Tulane. But I meet this girl from Louisiana, tell her I'm thinking of going to Emory. She's like, oh, no. You can't go to Emory. We'll never see each other. You must go to Tulane. You'll only be an hour and 15 minutes away. And I said, of course I'll do that. And I changed my entire life plan for this young woman. And that's how I end up at Tulane University. And it didn't work out. I mean, it did work out because I married a wonderful woman, not her. We broke up after freshman year of college, but she got me there. And if I don't go to Tulane, I don't meet those men, they don't give me that job, and you know the rest of the story. But let's even get deeper. The only reason I met Monica, that was her name, I assume still is her name. The only reason I met Monica was because I was a debater. And the only reason I was a debater, you might think, based on what I've done here today, that I came out of the womb debating. But that isn't actually true. I was an athlete. I was a jock. I was a baseball player. And I had been a really good baseball player. Like now, I wasn't as good as Donald Trump. You know, Donald Trump, just so you know this, baseball fans, Donald Trump is on the record saying he was the best baseball player in New York City in 1962, which I should point out is a year in which the Yankees won the World Series without Donald Trump. But Donald Trump was better than Mickey Mantle. He was better than Roger Maris. He was better than Whitey Ford. He was better than Elston Howard. I wasn't Donald Trump good, but I was good. I had college recruiters coming to my games when I was in Little League, thinking that was going to be my path, right? And then something happened. I tried out for my high school team. And I had an inexplicably horrible tryout, right? Like epically bad. It was like the tryout when Michael Jordan, I don't know if you know the story, Michael Jordan tried out for his high school team, first time he got cut, had a horrible tryout. It happens, right? Even when you're good at something. So I had this awful, awful tryout and got cut from the team. And so now I had to find a different activity, right? If I make that baseball team, I'm not going to be a debater. I'm not going to be at a debate camp over the summer. I'm going to be playing more ball over the summer. I'm not going to meet Monica. She's not going to convince me to go to Tulane. I'm not going to meet those men. I'm not going to get that job to fight David Duke, and I'm not going to be here. What I'm trying to say to you is that really the only reason I'm standing here, whiteness and that asshole that cut me from the baseball team. And thank God for him. I mean, I'm just saying. And I'm telling you that story because I think it's so important for us to take ownership of our trajectory. Because once we do, and everyone in here has got some similar kind of thing. You know, I tried to explain this to my kids, right, to talk about all the different things that had to happen for them to even exist. I shouldn't have done that. They were like 9 and 10 or something when I did it. That was sort of cruel. Like they're in the back of the car and they were acting up and I'm like, let me tell you how lucky you are to even be here. So I go through the whole story, right? And they're crying by the end, so they're going to need therapy. But the point is, like, if we get clear on our story, then it's hard to continue to rationalize the pain with which so many people live, because that could be our pain. And our glory and our successes could be their glory and their successes if just a few things had gone differently, right? We are all just a couple of degrees removed from, you know, sitting on a street corner, lying in the gutter. And we don't want to admit that because we want to feel like we're in control of our destiny. But our destiny is not something over which we have total control. So we have to have solidarity, not only because it's the moral thing to do, but because we never know when we're going to need somebody to show solidarity with us. One more question real quick, and then I'll let you get out of here. Yeah.
My name's Keon Thomas. You have a nice perspective of like how black and poor people are Like, where did you come from that? Like, how did you come?
So I would like to think, and I do think, that I learned over many years to listen, and not just to listen, but to believe what people tell me about their lives. I figured out early on something that isn't really all that radical, and it shouldn't be that difficult to figure out, but I gather it is hard for some people, that people are the best interpreters of their own lives. They're far better at interpreting their life than I am. And so working in public housing certainly had a lot to do with it, and listening to the stories of poor people, mostly of color. But it actually began before that, and I have to give my mom some credit for this, because when I was 4 in 1972, my mother made the decision to enroll me in a preschool program at Tennessee State University, which, for those who don't know, is a historically black college in Nashville. So I was in the early childhood ed program at a black school in the black part of town, one of only 3 non-black kids in the class, and a program run mostly by black women. 2 reasons that's important. Number one, it meant that my peer group early on that I was socialized in was going to be mostly non-white. And that's important because it meant, and I realize like all white people will tell you that we have black friends. And just so we're clear, we're usually lying when we say that. Like literally, there's a survey that found that 75% of white people say that we have many black friends. Many means like 4 or more, right? Because 1 would be a, 2 would be a couple, 3 would be a few. So if you say many, you're telling me 4 or more. Well, 75% of white people is like 145 million people, each having 4 black friends. There are only 35 million black people to go around. And the same survey found that half of all black folks say they don't have any white friends at all. So it's really only 17.5 million black people that we get to hang out with. So most white folks will tell you that, and they're not telling you the truth. I literally didn't have anything else. Like, that was pretty much my whole friendship circle for a minute, you know? And then as I got older, that's who I played ball with. It's who I hung out with in school. The reason that was important was once I get into, like, elementary school, middle school, I'm seeing the way that the black folks are being treated differently. And I'm able to see it because I've had that experience. Like, you know, if the black kids are being punished, even though the white kids are acting up just as much, but they're the ones getting sent to the office, right? Or if the black kids are getting put on one side of the room and given like basic level material, and the white kids are all getting like the advanced level, honors level stuff. Probably for most white kids in that environment, they wouldn't notice it because to them, that level of separation was really normal for them. That's just like every day. But for me, that didn't make any sense coming out of Tennessee State. So I'm like, why are these people that I'm friends with, or at least like they look like the people I'm friends with, so I identify with them, why are they being treated differently? And I didn't have a language for it. I didn't have words for it, right? It's not like I went home on the first week of first grade and was like, Mom, you are not going to believe the institutional white supremacy in first grade. Why would you put me in this awful place? It's not like I had language for it, but I knew something was going on. I file it away, file it away, file it away. The second reason it was important to be there was because I was having to be subordinated to black authority. Those black women that ran that program could have and would not have hesitated to put me out of the room, right? They weren't going to put up with any of my mess. They would have sent my happy ass back to Green Hills on the other side of town. So I was being subordinated to black authority. How many white people, even today at the age of 4, let alone 1972 at the age of 4, were truly subordinated to black authority, and particularly the authority of black women? So reason that's important is 24 years later when I'm working in public housing, mostly with black women who are the leaders in those communities, and they're telling me what's up. I'm not gonna be the white guy that's like, are you sure? Are you sure? Like, maybe you misunderstood. I know you think it was racism, but maybe it wasn't that at all. Maybe you don't know your own life. Maybe you've lost your mind. Because that is what, in effect, many of us say. But because I was taught to respect black authority, when black women told me what's up and what the deal was, my response was, all right then, let's get busy. I learned to trust what they were telling me. Let's get busy on fixing that problem then, and I'm going to believe you. So it's not some profound insight of mine. It is a combination of the experiences that I was lucky enough to have early on, and then the training and the mentorship that I received from activists in New Orleans, mostly of color, People's Institute folks and other folks, to get me to a place where I could sit with the discomfort of having to address my own privilege. And listen, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. There was a time when I resisted this like the plague, man. There was a time, I write about it in White Like Me, where, and this was a few years into doing the work. I was already doing the work about racism, but I didn't want to deal with the privilege piece, you know? I didn't want to own that. It's always easy to look at the downside. You don't want to look at the upside, right? So I remember one day there was a woman who's now a friend of mine who was coming into New Orleans to give a talk at Loyola University right next to Tulane. She was being brought in by the People's Institute, folks who would later train me in anti-racism, dismantling racism methods. And she was coming in to give a talk about how white privilege operates within progressive communities, right? Just like within so-called liberal circles and organizations. And I didn't want to hear that, man. I didn't want to hear that. I was not ready to hear that. I wanted to hear about all the evil right-wing people that we needed to do. I didn't want to hear about how white privilege and racism function in the spaces where I operated. So I was real resistant to it. I didn't even want to go to it, but then a buddy of mine was like, "You want to go?" I'm like, "Yeah, let's go. Let's go." So we go. We weren't going to disrupt or anything. We were just going to sit there and be real, smug and cynical, and then we were going to leave and like talk about it or whatever, right? So we go and we're listening and we leave and we're just like ripping on this presentation and that's just ridiculous and we don't have the luxury of fighting among ourselves and blah, 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 white privilege, what are you talking about? Blah, blah. And then my friend's like, "So what do you want to do now?" I'm like, "I don't know what you want to do." He's like, "I don't know, you want to go back of Audubon Park near the zoo and smoke weed?" I'm like, "Yeah." Note the irony, right? White privilege, what do you want to do now? Let's get high. Okay, so in effect, as we were denying the existence of white privilege, we then proceeded to go and exercise it, knowing that we could blaze up in the back of the park and not get arrested in a way that black folks would, because they're not looking for us to be doing that. So we're back there getting high, talking about how white privilege is not real. If you don't see the irony in that, you're not paying attention, right? And so it took a minute. I had to come down from that to actually... And then I was like, "Oh my God, what have I done?" You know, then it sort of hit me what I had done. And it didn't hit me right away, actually. It was a delayed reaction many years later, actually. But do you see what I'm saying? Like it's hard. You don't want to acknowledge it. But the deal is every one of us in this room has got some kind of privilege relative to somebody else. You may not have white privilege, but you might have male privilege. You may not have male privilege, but you might have straight privilege. You might not have straight privilege, but if you're able-bodied, you have privilege relative to the disabled. If you're able to hear what I am saying because you're not deaf, you have privilege vis-a-vis those who are in the deaf community. If you have education, if you have a college degree, you have privilege relative to what? 99.999% of the people on the planet. Everybody's got some area where we're the dominant group. And the task before us is for people who, we always know when we're the down group that what we sort of have to do. We have to fight and we have to scrape and we have to change the system. But when you're the top of the pile, when you're the dominant group, you sometimes, you don't see it, you don't understand it, and as a result, you're oblivious to the reality that other people experience. The task is to relinquish that obliviousness, and that means learning to listen to the marginalized on all these different trajectories of marginalization. Once we learn to do that, and I am very thankful and blessed that I was given the opportunity to learn how to do that in communities like New Orleans. Once we learn to do that, this is going to get a lot easier. But right now, we just don't have the interest in listening to those who have been marginalized, because when they remind us of their pain, they remind us of our failures, and they remind us of our inadequacies, and they remind us that there but for the grace of God go I, and we don't want to stare that in the face, you know. So thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. Have a great rest of the conference.